The weight of Gideon Ryder's grief was as vast as the Montana sky stretching above him, infinite and unyielding as he stood motionless before the simple wooden cross marking his wife's grave. October 1878 had brought the first frost to the valley, silvering the tall grass around the small homestead cemetery where Eleanor had rested for exactly 1 year today. His weathered hat was clutched against his chest, the brim crumpled from the strength of his grip, while the wind tugged at his dark hair streaked prematurely with gray at the temples. "I miss you something fierce, Ellie," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Living alone on their ranch these past 12 months, he'd almost forgotten the sound of his own words. The only company he kept these days were the cattle, his horse Thunder, and the memories that haunted every corner of the home they'd built together. Gideon didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until they were nearly upon him. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the intrusion on his private morning. The rider dismounted with a soft thud on the frozen ground, but still he kept his eyes fixed on Eleanor's name, crudely carved by his own hand into the wooden marker. "Mr. Ryder," a woman's voice, unfamiliar yet somehow warm despite the chill in the air. He turned slowly, reluctantly, to find a slender figure standing a respectful distance away. Her riding clothes were practical but well-made, her chestnut hair partially tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her eyes, the deep green of pine needles, regarded him with a compassion that made his chest ache. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, then paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing, "but I've watched you stand here every day this week." She took a single step forward. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Gideon's throat tightened. "I don't recall asking for company, madam," Zara Morgan, she supplied, undeterred by his coldness. "I purchased the Willows property to the east last month." She gestured vaguely toward the neighboring ranch. "And no, you didn't ask. But sometimes what we need most isn't what we think to ask for." The wind gusted harder, causing them both to shiver. Gideon's instinct was to turn away, to retreat back into his solitude, but something in her steady gaze held him in place. It wasn't pity he saw there, but understanding the kind that only comes from having endured similar pain. "I've got chores waiting," he finally said, settling his hat back onto his head. Zara nodded. "As do I, but Mr. Ryder." She hesitated, then reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I brought apple pie. My mother always said breaking bread was the proper way to introduce yourself to neighbors." A hint of a smile touched her lips, even the stubborn ones. Despite himself, the corner of Gideon's mouth twitched upward. It was the closest thing to a smile that had crossed his face in months. "Stubborn, is it? That's what my foreman tells me about you. Says you're the most hard-headed rancher in the territory, but fair in your dealings." "Your foreman talks too much." "That he does." She extended the bundle toward him. "The pie's still warm." Gideon hesitated, then reached out to accept her offering. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, a momentary contact that somehow cut through the numbness that had enveloped him for so long. "Thank you, Miss Morgan." "Mrs.," she corrected gently. "Though it's been 3 years since Mr. Morgan passed," understanding dawned in Gideon's eyes. So that's why she recognized his grief so clearly she carried her own. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience. "The invitation stands, Mr. Ryder," Zara continued, returning to her horse with practiced ease. "Sunday dinner at my place. Nothing fancy, just food that isn't your own cooking for a change." She swung into the saddle with a grace that spoke of years in the saddle. Sometimes talking helps, sometimes just sitting in silence with someone who understands helps more. Before he could respond, she turned her mount and rode away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the vast emptiness of the valley. Gideon stood watching until she disappeared over the rise, the warm bundle of pie still in his hands, its sweet scent rising to mingle with the crisp autumn air. He turned back to Eleanor's grave one last time. "What do you think of that, Ellie?" he murmured. Only the whisper of wind through the grass answered him, but somehow it felt less like silence than it had before. For the first time in a year, Gideon Ryder returned to his empty house, carrying something more substantial than grief, a small, unexpected spark of possibility. The apple pie sat untouched on Gideon's kitchen table for nearly 2 hours before he finally surrendered to its temptation. The first bite made him close his eyes involuntarily. It had been so long since he'd tasted anything made with care. His own cooking was utilitarian at best: beans, coffee, the occasional stringy piece of beef. This was something else entirely. As he ate, he found himself glancing toward the mantel where Eleanor's portrait sat. They'd saved for months to have it done in Helena on their 5th anniversary. She'd worn her best dress, her blonde hair arranged carefully, though the artist had captured the hint of mischief in her blue eyes that no amount of formal posing could disguise. "She seems decent enough," he said aloud to the portrait. "Not trying to replace you, Ellie, just bringing pie." The portrait stared back, silent, but somehow not disapproving. Eleanor had always been the social one, dragging him to barn raisings and harvest festivals when he would have preferred the company of his cattle. "You can't be a hermit, Gideon Ryder," she'd scolded him more than once. People need people. Sunday came, and Gideon surprised himself by shaving carefully, even nicking his chin in his concentration. He put on his good shirt, the blue one Eleanor had ordered from a catalog in their last year together. It was a bit tight across the shoulders now he'd lost weight since her passing, but his work kept his frame solid. He saddled Thunder, his bay gelding, and tucked the now clean pie cloth into his saddlebag. The Willows Ranch lay 3 miles east, nestled against the foothills. It had belonged to old man Jenkins before his sons convinced him to move back east with them. The place had been empty for nearly 2 years. As he rode, Gideon rehearsed what he might say, but each attempt at conversation sounded hollow in his mind. By the time the white painted farmhouse came into view, he'd nearly talked himself into turning back. Only the thought of Eleanor's disappointment at his rudeness kept him moving forward. The Willows had transformed in the month since Zara Morgan had taken ownership. The sagging porch had been repaired, the yard cleared of debris, and smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney. 2 horses grazed in the corral and chickens pecked industriously around the yard. It wasn't grand, but it had the unmistakable feel of a home cared for. Gideon had barely dismounted when the front door opened, and Zara stepped onto the porch. Today she wore a simple dress of deep blue, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight of her so clearly in her element made him momentarily forget the awkwardness of his presence. "You came," she said, and the genuine pleasure in her voice eased some of his tension. "Seemed rude to turn down good food," he replied, removing his hat. Her laugh was unexpected, a warm, rich sound that seemed to brighten the afternoon. "At least you're honest about your motivations, Mr. Ryder." "Gideon," he corrected, surprising himself. "If we're to be neighbors." "Gideon then, and I'm Zara." She gestured toward the house. "Come in, everything's nearly ready." The interior of the house was modest, but comfortable, with a few pieces of quality furniture that must have traveled with her from her previous life. The table was set for 2, with actual china plates and cloth napkins, touches of civilization that seemed almost foreign after his year of solitary existence. "You've done a lot with the place," he commented, standing awkwardly until she motioned him toward a chair. "It needed care, not unlike most things worth having." She moved confidently around the kitchen, bringing dishes to the table. "I hope you like venison stew. My foreman, Hank, brought down a buck last week. Been a while since I've had fresh venison," he admitted, watching her efficient movements. There was something calming about her presence, nothing fluttery or nervous in her manner. When they sat down to eat, she didn't push him to talk, allowing comfortable silences between their exchanges. She spoke instead of practical matters, her plans for the ranch, the challenges of the coming winter, a mountain lion that had been troubling her livestock. "Hank spotted it near the east pasture again yesterday," she explained, breaking a piece of cornbread. "We've lost 3 sheep already." "Might be the same cat that took one of my calves last month," Gideon said, his interest genuinely piqued. "Big Tom from the tracks I found." "I'd be grateful for any help tracking it," Zara said. "Hank's a good foreman, but his eyesight isn't what it used to be." "I could ride out with you tomorrow," Gideon offered, then hastily added, "if you'd like." "I would, thank you." She smiled, and he noticed a small dimple in her right cheek that appeared briefly before vanishing. After the meal, they sat on the porch with coffee, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of amber and gold. The awkwardness Gideon had feared never materialized. Instead, he found himself oddly at ease in her company. How long were you married? Zara asked finally, her question gentle but direct. 8 years, he answered, staring into his coffee cup. Eleanor, Ellie, she took fever last fall. Doctor from town said there was nothing to be done. The familiar pain washed through him, but somehow it felt less drowning in Zara's presence. You said 3 years for you, she nodded. Thomas was thrown from his horse crossing the Bighorn River. We were moving west from Pennsylvania. Her voice held the steady tone of grief, accepted, if not forgotten. I continued on alone. He would have wanted that. It takes courage, Gideon said quietly, moving forward. Some days more than others, she agreed. When it came time for him to leave, Gideon found himself strangely reluctant. Standing by Thunder, hat in hand, he struggled to find the right words. Thank you for dinner, he finally said. It's been a pleasant evening. It has, Zara agreed. She hesitated, then added, the offer of company stands, Gideon, not just for mountain lion hunting. He nodded, settling his hat back on his head. Tomorrow then, for the tracking, I'll be ready at first light. As he rode home through the gathering darkness, Gideon realized he felt lighter than he had in months. Not happy, exactly, that emotion seemed too distant still, but something had shifted. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, he found himself looking forward to the next day with something other than resignation. The mountain air was sharp with frost when Gideon rode up to the Willows the following morning. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the underside of the clouds with delicate shades of pink and gold. He'd woken before his usual time, checking and rechecking his rifle, packing jerky and hardtack for the day's ride. Zara was already in the yard, adjusting the cinch on a dappled gray mare's saddle. She wore practical riding clothes, sturdy trousers tucked into well-worn boots, a thick woolen jacket, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield against the morning sun. A Winchester rifle was secured in her saddle's scabbard. You handle firearms? Gideon asked by way of greeting, dismounting to check Thunder's girth strap. Since I was 12, she replied without looking up from her task. My father had no sons, so he taught me instead, scandalized my mother's entire family. There was a note of pride in her voice that made Gideon's lips twitch toward a smile. The cat's tracks were last seen heading toward Blacktail Creek, she continued, swinging easily into the saddle. We should start there. They rode east in companionable silence as the sun crept higher. Gideon found himself stealing glances at his companion. In the morning light, he could see the subtle auburn highlights in her chestnut hair where it escaped from beneath her hat. Her profile was strong but feminine, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a determined set to her jaw. She rode with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent most of her life on horseback. At the creek, they dismounted to examine the ground. Gideon crouched, pushing aside the frost-covered grass to reveal distinct paw prints in the soft mud near the water's edge. Fresh, he murmured. From before dawn, I'd wager. Zara knelt beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his as she studied the tracks. Big one, see the width of the pad, she pointed, her finger tracing the outline without disturbing the impression. Male for certain, Gideon agreed, heading upstream. Probably has a den in the rocks above the meadow. They remounted and followed the creek, moving carefully, eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of movement. The morning warmed slightly as they climbed, though their breath still clouded in the air. The conversation between them flowed naturally from practical matters, the best positions for a clean shot, the habits of mountain lions to more personal exchanges. You're not from Montana originally, Gideon observed as they navigated a narrow path through a stand of aspens, their golden leaves shimmering in the sunlight. Pennsylvania, as I mentioned. My father ran a lumber operation near Pittsburgh. She ducked beneath a low-hanging branch. But I always wanted open sky. Thomas felt the same. We were planning our move west when we married. What made you choose this particular spot? Honestly, she glanced back at him with a small smile. I like the name the Willows. There's something peaceful about it. And when I saw the creek lined with them, it felt like a sign. Gideon nodded, understanding the sentiment more than he might have expected. He and Eleanor had chosen their land for similarly intangible reasons. Something about the way the evening light hit the eastern ridge had spoken to them both. They stopped to rest the horses around midday in a small clearing. Gideon built a small fire while Zara laid out their simple provisions. As they ate, He found himself telling her about his journey west from Ohio as a young man of 19, working cattle drives up from Texas, before saving enough to stake his claim on what became the Ryder Ranch. Eleanor was the daughter of the general store owner in Helena, he said, surprised at how easily her name now came to his lips. She could have had any man in the territory, but for some reason she set her sights on me. I doubt it was for some reason, Zara replied with a gentle smile. You sell yourself short, Gideon Ryder. Before he could respond, a movement on the ridge above them caught his attention. Gideon raised a hand for silence, slowly reaching for his rifle. Zara followed his gaze and nodded, easing her own weapon from its scabbard with practiced stealth. There, on a rocky outcropping 100 yards above them, stood their quarry, a massive mountain lion, its tawny coat gleaming in the midday sun. The cat hadn't spotted them yet, its attention focused on something beyond their view. Gideon raised his rifle, sighting carefully along the barrel. Beside him, Zara did the same. The cat turned, seeming to sense their presence at last, its golden eyes narrowing as it spotted the humans below. On three, Gideon whispered. 1, 2, their rifles cracked almost simultaneously, the sound echoing off the surrounding hills. The mountain lion jerked, then collapsed on the outcropping, rolling partway down the slope before coming to rest against a boulder. Good shot, Zara said, lowering her rifle. Both of us, Gideon agreed. He couldn't be certain whose bullet had found its mark, and somehow it didn't matter. There was a shared satisfaction in their success. They climbed carefully to where the cat lay. It was indeed the Tom they'd been tracking, massive paws, scarred face, and a coat thick with the approach of winter. Gideon knelt beside it, running a respectful hand over its powerful shoulder. Magnificent creature, Zara murmured. Shame it developed a taste for livestock. Nature of things, Gideon replied. No malice in it, just survival. They worked together to secure the cat's body onto Zara's mare, planning to take the hide back to the willows. The sun was beginning its westward descent by the time they finished, casting long shadows across the landscape. We should start back, Gideon suggested, eyeing the gathering clouds to the north. Weather's turning. They rode more quickly on the return journey, the temperature dropping noticeably as the clouds thickened above them. When the first snowflakes began to fall, Zara looked up with childlike delight. First snow of the season, she said, extending a gloved hand to catch the delicate flakes. Always feels like a beginning, doesn't it? Gideon watched her, struck by the simple joy in her expression. It had been so long since he'd seen anything as more than an obstacle or a necessity. The snow, the successful hunt, the companionship of the day, all of it felt somehow significant. As if he were waking from a long, gray dream into a world where colors existed again. By the time they reached the willows, the snowfall had intensified, blanketing the landscape in white. The light was fading rapidly, and the wind had picked up, driving the snow in swirling eddies around them. You shouldn't try to make it back to your place tonight, Zara said as they unsaddled their horses in her barn. The storm's setting in properly now. Gideon hesitated, aware of the propriety issues but equally conscious of the deteriorating conditions. I've ridden through worse. No doubt, she replied, hanging her saddle on its rack. But why risk it when there's a perfectly good guest room here, unless... She turned to face him, a hint of challenge in her expression. Unless you're afraid of what people might say, there's hardly anyone close enough to say anything, he pointed out. True enough, she smiled. So stay. We'll dress out that cat, have a hot meal, and you can leave at first light if the weather clears. The practicality of her suggestion overcame his hesitation. They worked together to skin the mountain lion, a messy but necessary task, performed in the shelter of the barn as the snow continued to fall outside. Zara was skilled with a knife, her movements precise and efficient. By the time they finished, cleaning up as best they could with cold water from the pump, evening had fully descended. Inside the house, Zara stoked the fire in the hearth while Gideon awkwardly stood in the kitchen, unsure of his place in this domestic scene. Make yourself useful and slice that bread, she instructed, nodding toward a loaf on the sideboard. The simple task gave him purpose, easing his discomfort. They ate a simple meal of reheated stew and fresh bread, the warmth of the food and fire gradually thawing the chill from their bones. Outside, the wind howled around the corners of the house, emphasizing the coziness within. "I've been thinking about planting an orchard come spring," Zara said, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Apples mainly, maybe some plums." "That south-facing slope near the creek seems ideal." "It's good land for it," Gideon agreed. "Well-drained, protected from the worst winds." He hesitated, then added, "I could help with the planting if you'd like. I've some experience with fruit trees." "I'd welcome the help." She studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You know, Gideon, neighbors traditionally assist one another out here. It's not charity to accept or offer help, it's survival." He recognized the gentle rebuke in her words. "I've not been much of a neighbor this past year." "Grief takes its own time," she said simply. "No one would fault you for that." Later, as Zara showed him to the small but comfortable guest room, Gideon found himself strangely reluctant for the day to end. Standing in the doorway, hat in hand, he searched for words to express his gratitude for more than just the shelter from the storm. "Thank you," he finally said. "For today, all of it." Zara's smile was soft in the lamplight. "Thank you for the company, Gideon. Sleep well." That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed listening to the storm rage outside, Gideon realized he had gone an entire day without being crushed by grief. Eleanor was still there, a presence in his thoughts, but the sharp edges of loss had somehow softened. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that moving forward didn't necessarily mean leaving her behind. The heavy snowfall continued through the night and into the next morning, forcing Gideon to extend his stay at the Willows. What might have been awkward instead felt surprisingly natural, as they fell into a rhythm of shared tasks feeding livestock, clearing paths through the deepening snow, preparing meals. They talked more freely, learning the contours of each other's lives, discovering unexpected commonalities and differences that sparked engaging debates. On the third day, when the storm finally abated, revealing a transformed landscape of pristine white under brilliant blue skies, Gideon found himself inventing reasons to delay his departure. It was Zara who finally addressed the situation directly. "You know," she said as they stood on her porch surveying the glittering expanse of snow, "there's a traditional Thanksgiving gathering in Sweetwater next week. Most of the valley attends." Gideon stiffened slightly. The thought of facing so many people, of the inevitable expressions of pity when they saw him without Eleanor, made his stomach clench. "I haven't much appetite for celebrations," he said stiffly. Zara turned to face him, her expression serious. "I'm not suggesting you dance a jig, Gideon. But isolation feeds grief, gives it too much room to grow." She hesitated, then added more softly, "I'll be going. I'd welcome your company." The simple honesty of her request disarmed him. She wasn't pushing or prodding, merely offering an option, leaving the choice entirely his. "I'll consider it," he said finally, which felt like a massive concession. Her smile told him she recognized it as such. "That's all I ask." When he finally rode back to his own ranch that afternoon, the world seemed changed not just by the snow that had transformed the familiar landscape, but by something less tangible. The ranch house that had felt like a mausoleum for so long now seemed merely a house in need of care. He found himself noticing things he'd overlooked for months: a loose shutter, a gap in the porch railing, the general air of neglect that had crept over the property in his year of emotional absence. That evening, after tending to long-neglected repairs, Gideon once again stood before Eleanor's portrait on the mantel. "Met someone," he told her quietly. "Not like that," he hastily added, then shook his head at his own foolishness. "She's a neighbor. Zara Morgan bought the Jenkins place." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "She knows about loss, understands it." He stared at Eleanor's painted smile, remembering how she'd always encouraged him to be more social, to reach beyond his natural reserve. "There's a gathering in town next week, Thanksgiving, thinking I might go." He swallowed hard. "You'd want me to, I reckon." In the silence that followed, Gideon felt something shift within him, not an ending, but perhaps the tentative beginning of healing. He reached out, gently touching the frame of Eleanor's portrait. "I'll always love you, Ellie," he whispered. "That won't ever change." The days leading up to Thanksgiving brought a temporary thaw, turning the pristine snow to slush and making the roads between ranches passable again. Gideon found himself riding to the Willows more often than strictly necessary. sometimes with practical excuses discussing spring planting, offering to mend a broken corral gate, and sometimes simply seeking the company he'd denied himself for so long. Zara always welcomed him without comment on the frequency of his visits, as if his presence were the most natural thing in the world. They fell into easy routines, working side by side, sharing meals, talking long into the evenings by the fire. He learned that she loved poetry and could recite Wordsworth from memory, that she whistled tunelessly while working, that she had strong opinions about politics and wasn't shy about expressing them. In turn, he found himself sharing parts of himself he'd kept guarded his dream of expanding the ranch to include the unclaimed valley to the north. His secret enjoyment of the penny novels Eleanor used to read aloud on winter evenings. His fear that he wasn't the man his father had hoped he'd become. "I think we rarely become exactly what our parents envision," Zara had commented thoughtfully. "Perhaps that's as it should be. We have to live our own stories, not continuations of theirs." The morning of the Thanksgiving gathering dawned clear and cold. Gideon stood before the small mirror in his bedroom, critically assessing his appearance. He'd trimmed his beard, combed his hair neatly, and put on his best shirt and waistcoat. The face that looked back at him seemed somehow both familiar and strange, older than he remembered, lined by grief and hard work, but with eyes that held something new, a cautious lightness that hadn't been there before. He'd arranged to meet Zara at her ranch, from where they would ride together into Sweetwater. When he arrived, he found her dressed in a deep green wool dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in a simple but elegant style that softened the usual practical severity of her appearance. "You clean up nicely, Mr. Ryder," she said with a smile, accepting his hand to mount her mare. "As do you, Mrs. Morgan," he replied, suddenly aware of a fluttering nervousness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the prospect of facing the townspeople. The 3-mile ride to Sweetwater passed quickly, their conversation easy despite Gideon's growing apprehension. As they approached the town, he could hear the sounds of music and laughter drifting from the community hall, a large wooden structure that served as church, schoolhouse, and gathering place for the scattered population of the valley. Gideon hesitated at the hitching post, his courage faltering at the final moment. Zara dismounted and came to stand beside him, not touching him but close enough that he could feel her presence like a tangible support. "We don't have to stay long," she said quietly. "Just long enough to remind people you're still among the living." He nodded, grateful for her understanding, and together they walked toward the hall. Heads turned as they entered, conversations pausing momentarily before resuming with increased vigor. Gideon felt the weight of curious glances, heard the whispers that followed their progress through the room. "Gideon Ryder, as I live and breathe." The booming voice of Magnus Peterson, the blacksmith, cut through the murmurs. The big man approached, hand extended. "Good to see you among us again, friend." Others followed, ranchers he'd done business with, the general store owner who'd been Eleanor's employer before their marriage, neighbors he'd barely spoken to in a year. Their greetings were warm but carefully modulated, mentioning Eleanor just enough to acknowledge her absence without dwelling on it. Through it all, Zara remained at his side, not possessive but steadfastly present, smoothing awkward moments with well-timed comments or questions. When the initial flurry of greetings subsided, they found a relatively quiet corner where they could observe the festivities while maintaining some distance. "You're doing fine," Zara murmured, handing him a cup of cider from the refreshment table. "Thanks to you," he replied honestly. "I'd have turned tail at the door without you here." The evening progressed more easily than Gideon had feared. The food was plentiful, the music lively, and while he declined invitations to dance, he found himself drawn into conversations about cattle prices, the early snow, and predictions for the coming winter. It was ordinary talk, the mundane exchanges of a community bound by proximity and shared challenges, but to Gideon it felt like a gradual re-entry into a world he'd abandoned. As the evening wore on, he noticed something else: the way other men looked at Zara. She was, he realized with a strange jolt, an attractive widow with property of her own, a desirable match in a territory where women were scarce. The thought created an unexpected surge of possessiveness that took him by surprise. "Mrs. Morgan, might I have this dance?" A tall, well-dressed man whom Gideon recognized as Jonathan Walsh, the banker from Helena who owned several properties in the area, bowed slightly before Zara. She glanced at Gideon, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded stiffly, though something inside him rebelled at the sight of her being led onto the dance floor by another man. Walsh's hand rested properly at her waist as they moved through the steps of a waltz, but Gideon found himself noticing every smile, every exchanged word between them. "They make a handsome couple, don't they?" Martha Simmons, the postmistress, had sidled up beside him, her eyes sparkling with the love of gossip. "I hear he's been calling at the Willows regularly since she arrived. Man of means, Jonathan is, could give a woman a comfortable life." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Morgan seems capable of providing for herself just fine." "Oh, no doubt, no doubt," Martha nodded vigorously, "but a woman alone faces challenges, especially come winter." "Having a man around, excuse me," Gideon interrupted curtly, suddenly unable to bear another word. He moved away, finding temporary refuge near the door where the cool night air provided some relief from the unexpected heat of jealousy coursing through him. What right did he have to feel this way? Zara was a free woman entitled to dance with whomever she pleased, to consider suitors if she wished. Their friendship, for that's what it was, he told himself, firmly gave him no claim on her. And yet, watching her move gracefully in Walsh's arms, her face animated as they conversed, Gideon was forced to confront the truth he'd been carefully avoiding. His feelings for Zara Morgan had grown beyond mere friendship, beyond the comfort of shared grief, into something deeper and more complicated. The realization left him shaken. Was he betraying Eleanor by feeling this way? Was it too soon? Would it always be too soon? Lost in these troubled thoughts, he didn't notice Zara's approach until she spoke. "Are you all right?" Her voice was soft with concern. "You look pale." "Just need some air," he managed, pushing open the door and stepping onto the porch. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing overhead in the vast Montana sky. Zara followed him outside, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders against the chill. "Did something happen?" "No," he said quickly, then sighed, unable to maintain the pretense. "Yes, I don't know." He turned to face her, struggling to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. "You and Walsh seemed friendly." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by something that might have been amusement. "Jonathan, he's been trying to convince me to sell the Willows to him since I arrived. Seems to think a woman can't possibly manage a ranch successfully." Relief washed through Gideon, followed immediately by embarrassment at his reaction. "I'm sorry." "It wasn't my place to know," she agreed, but there was no anger in her voice. "It wasn't, but I'm not entirely displeased by your concern." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face in the moonlight. "Gideon, what are we doing?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I just know I've felt more alive these past weeks than I have all year. Because of you." Zara nodded slowly. "I feel it too, this connection between us." She hesitated, then continued more carefully, "But I need to know if you're ready, truly ready. Not just for company or friendship, but for whatever this might become." It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one he'd been unable to answer even to himself. Standing there in the cold November night, with the sounds of music and laughter spilling from the hall behind them, Gideon Ryder finally confronted the truth. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said slowly, "but I know I want to be with you." Something softened in Zara's expression. She reached out, her gloved hand gently touching his arm. "Then perhaps that's enough for now, to want to be ready." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Gideon found himself wanting to draw her closer, to discover if her lips were as soft as they looked in the silvery moonlight. But it was too soon, too public a place for such intimacy. Instead, he offered his arm. "Would you like to dance, Mrs. Morgan? I'm afraid I'm not as polished as your banker friend, but I can manage not to step on your toes." Her smile was radiant as she placed her hand on his sleeve. "I would be delighted, Mr. Ryder." They returned to the hall, joining the other couples for a simple country dance that required more enthusiasm than skill. Gideon moved stiffly at first, acutely conscious of the curious glances directed their way, but Zara's evident enjoyment was infectious. By the end of the dance, he found himself smiling genuinely, caught up in the simple pleasure of the moment. Later, as they rode home through the starlit night, a comfortable silence settled between them. The events of the evening had shifted something, acknowledged feelings that had been growing unspoken. Nothing was resolved, nothing definitively changed, but possibilities now existed where before there had been only grief and solitude. At the fork in the road where they would part ways, Gideon to his ranch, Zara to the willows, they paused, reluctant to end the evening. "I'm glad you came tonight," Zara said softly. "Because of you," he replied simply. "Thank you for everything." She smiled, her face half-shadowed in the darkness. "Good night, Gideon." "Good night, Zara." As he rode the remaining distance to his ranch, Gideon felt lighter than he had in months, as if some burden he'd carried for so long had begun to ease. The ranch house, when he reached it, seemed less empty somehow, filled with the promise of tomorrow rather than the shadows of yesterday. Winter descended in earnest following Thanksgiving, blanketing the valley in deep snow and sealing the scattered ranches in relative isolation. For most, it was a time of forced confinement, of waiting out the long dark months until spring's return. But for Gideon and Zara, the winter became something unexpected, a season of tentative renewal. Despite the challenging conditions, they found ways to see each other regularly. Gideon would ride to the willows with the excuse of checking on her livestock or bringing supplies from his better-stocked root cellar. Zara would appear at his door with freshly baked bread or a book she thought he might enjoy. Their visits grew longer, more comfortable, the boundaries between them softening with each encounter. December brought the Christmas season, a time Gideon had been dreading for its memories of holidays spent with Eleanor. But when Zara invited him to help cut a tree for her parlor, he found himself agreeing without hesitation. They spent a crisp afternoon searching the hillsides for the perfect pine, laughing as they trudged through snow that sometimes reached their knees. When they finally found a suitable tree small enough to fit in the parlor but full and symmetrical, Gideon felled it with efficient strokes of his axe, while Zara watched with appreciative eyes. "You make that look easy," she commented, as he hoisted the tree onto his shoulder. "Plenty of practice," he replied. "My father insisted we always have the tallest tree in the county when I was growing up." "What were your Christmases like as a child?" she asked as they made their way back toward the house, the scent of fresh pine filling the air around them. Gideon found himself describing the boisterous holiday gatherings of his youth, his mother's elaborate feasts, his father's insistence on reading the Christmas story from the family Bible before any presents could be opened, the chaos of 5 children tearing into gifts at dawn. "It sounds wonderful," Zara said wistfully. "My Christmases were more restrained. Father believed excessive celebration was undignified." "And what do you believe?" Gideon asked, surprised by his own boldness. She considered this as they reached the porch, stomping snow from their boots. "I believe joy should never be restrained when it can be shared." Her eyes met his, warm despite the cold air between them. "Life has enough sorrow without us dampening its moments of brightness." Inside, they set up the tree in the corner of the parlor, Zara directing its placement with a critical eye for symmetry. From a trunk, she produced simple ornaments, wooden stars painted gold, red paper birds, strings of dried berries, and popcorn. "Thomas and I made these our first Christmas together," she explained, handling the delicate ornaments with care. "Not as fine as store-bought, perhaps, but meaningful." Gideon watched her arranging the decorations, struck by the grace of her movements and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of pine and the warm glow of the fire, he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "Zara," he said, her name emerging more roughly than he'd intended. She turned, an ornament dangling forgotten from her fingers, something in his tone alerting her to the shift in his mood. "Yes," words failed him. Instead, he closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her face gently between his calloused hands. He hesitated just a moment, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but she remained still, her eyes wide and expectant. When his lips finally met hers, it was with a tenderness that belied the intensity of his desire. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, yet it contained a promise that left them both breathless when they parted. "I'm sorry," he said automatically, though his eyes told a different story. I shouldn't have. Yes, you should, she interrupted, her voice steady despite the flush in her cheeks. And I'm hoping you'll do it again. This time when they kissed, all hesitation vanished. Gideon's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as her hands came up to rest against his chest. It was a kiss of discovery, of mutual hunger too long denied, of possibilities opening before them like a path through previously uncharted territory. When they finally separated, Gideon rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to move too far from the warmth of her embrace. I didn't plan that, he admitted. The best things in life are rarely planned, she replied, her smile touching something deep within him that had been dormant for too long. They finished decorating the tree in a state of heightened awareness, every accidental touch, every shared glance charged with new meaning. When Gideon finally prepared to leave propriety still governing their behavior despite the change between them, Zara walked him to the door, her hand clasped in his. Will you come for Christmas dinner? She asked. It won't be anything elaborate, but I'd rather not spend the day alone. I'd be honored, he replied, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and perfectly right. As he rode home through the gathering dusk, snow beginning to fall in gentle flakes around him, Gideon felt a strange mixture of elation and guilt. The elation was easy to understand. Zara Morgan had awakened feelings in him he'd thought permanently extinguished, but the guilt. At home, he stood before Eleanor's portrait as he always did, but tonight the conversation felt different. I kissed her, Ellie, he said quietly, and I wanted to. Want to again. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to articulate the complex emotions swirling within him. Is it wrong, too soon? Would you understand? The portrait offered no answers, just Eleanor's painted smile, forever frozen in time. But as Gideon stood there in the quiet house, he remembered something she had said during her final days when they both knew the end was approaching. Promise me you'll live, Gideon, she'd whispered, her hand fragile in his. Not just exist, really live, find joy again someday. He'd made the promise, though at the time it had seemed impossible to imagine joy without her. Now, with the memory of Zara's kiss still warm on his lips, he wondered if perhaps this was what Eleanor had wanted for him all along, not a lifetime of lonely fidelity to her memory, but the courage to open his heart again when the right person appeared. The realization didn't banish his guilt entirely, but it eased it, allowing the anticipation of seeing Zara again to take precedence over the shadows of the past. Christmas Day dawned clear and bitterly cold. Gideon spent the morning tending to his livestock, ensuring they had extra feed to sustain them through the frigid temperatures. By early afternoon, he was bathed, shaved, and dressed in his best clothes, with carefully wrapped packages secured in his saddlebags. The ride to the Willows was challenging, the snow deep enough in places that Thunder had to struggle through drifts that reached his chest. But the sight that greeted him upon arrival made the difficult journey worthwhile. Zara's house glowed with warm light, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney, evergreen boughs framing the doorway and windows. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching for his approach. The smile that lit her face at the sight of him drove the last of the cold from his bones. "Merry Christmas," she said, stepping back to allow him entry. "Merry Christmas," he replied, stamping snow from his boots before following her inside. The house was transformed, candles glowed on every surface. The small tree they'd decorated together sparkled in the corner, and the table was set with Zara's best china and linens. The scent of roasting goose and spiced cider filled the air, creating an atmosphere of celebration that enveloped him the moment he crossed the threshold. "You've been busy," he observed, taking in the festive scene. "I may have gone a bit overboard," she admitted with a laugh. "It's been a long time since I've had reason to celebrate properly." They exchanged gifts before dinner, practical items chosen with careful thought. Gideon had brought her a fine leather-bound journal and a set of pens, remembering how she'd mentioned her habit of recording her thoughts each evening. For him, she'd sewn a new wool scarf and matching gloves, the stitching even and precise. "To keep you warm on the ride between our ranches," she explained as he admired her handiwork. The meal that followed was the most enjoyable Gideon had experienced in longer than he could remember. Zara was an excellent cook, but it was her company more than the food that made the occasion special. They talked and laughed with an ease that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they'd known each other far longer than the few months of their acquaintance. After dinner, they sat before the fire, glasses of brandy warming in their hands, the comfortable silence between them broken only by the occasional pop and crackle of the burning logs. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, the wind picking up force as the evening progressed. "You shouldn't try to ride back tonight," Zara said, watching the worsening conditions through the window. "The storm's getting worse." Gideon nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "I'll sleep in the barn. I've done it before when caught in bad weather." "Don't be ridiculous," she replied firmly. "The guest room is perfectly adequate, as you well know." There was a moment of charged silence as they both recognized the implications of his staying the night under her roof. Though nothing improper would occur, the guest room was separate from her bedroom. Propriety would be maintained. It represented another step in their evolving relationship. "If you're certain," he said finally. "I am." Her eyes held his steadily. "I want you here, Gideon, safe and warm." Later, as they prepared for bed, Zara showing him again to the guest room, providing fresh towels and an extra quilt against the cold. There was a new awareness between them. An unspoken acknowledgement of desire carefully contained by mutual respect and the constraints of their time. Standing in the doorway of the guest room, Zara hesitated before bidding him good night. In the soft glow of the lamp she held, her face was luminous, her eyes reflecting emotions that matched his own. "Thank you for today," she said softly. "For making this Christmas something to remember rather than endure." "Thank you for giving me a reason to celebrate again," he replied, meaning it more deeply than words could express. She reached up, her free hand gently touching his cheek in a gesture so tender it made his heart ache. "Good night, Gideon." "Good night, Zara." He watched her walk down the hallway to her own room, the lamplight receding with her until he was left in darkness, filled with longing and a newfound hope that seemed to brighten the night around him. Morning brought a transformed world, snow piled in fantastic drifts, trees bent under its weight, the landscape rendered in shades of white and blue beneath a clearing sky. Gideon and Zara shared a quiet breakfast, both aware that his departure would be delayed by the need to clear paths to the barn and ensure the livestock were safe after the storm. They worked together through the morning, the physical labor comfortable and companionable. By noon, the essential tasks were complete, but the trails remained nearly impassable. "Stay another night," Zara suggested as they warmed themselves by the fire after the morning's work. "The sun will help clear the trails by tomorrow." Gideon agreed readily, secretly pleased by the extension of their time together. The day passed in simple domesticity, reading by the fire, preparing meals, talking about plans for their respective ranches come spring. It was a glimpse of what life might be like if they were truly together, and Gideon found himself increasingly certain that such a future was what he wanted. That evening, as they sat side by side on the small sofa before the fire, Zara's head coming to rest naturally against his shoulder, Gideon gathered his courage. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low in the quiet room, "about us, about what might be possible." Zara lifted her head to look at him, her expression serious but open. "As have I. I care for you, Zara, more than I thought possible after Eleanor." The admission felt momentous, a bridge crossed that could not be recrossed. "I'm not sure what that means yet or what you might want, but I needed you to know." She was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face in the firelight. "I care for you too, Gideon, deeply." She took a breath, seemed to gather her thoughts. "But I need you to be certain. Not just that you care for me, but that you're ready to build something new. I couldn't bear to be merely a consolation for what you've lost." "You could never be that," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "What I feel for you is entirely its own. Different from what I felt for Eleanor, but no less real." He struggled to find the right words. "It's like having loved the mountains all your life, then discovering the beauty of the sea. One doesn't diminish the other, they exist separately, both true." The analogy seemed to resonate with her. Zara's expression softened, and she squeezed his hands gently. "Then perhaps we should see where this leads us, slowly, with patience for the process." "I'd like that," Gideon agreed, relief and happiness flowing through him in equal measure. This time when they kissed, It was with a new understanding between them, not just of the present connection they shared, but of the potential future it might contain. Gideon drew her closer, savoring the softness of her in his arms, the sweet taste of her lips, the small sounds of pleasure she made as his hands tangled in her hair. They were restrained by the conventions of their time and their own sense of what was right, not allowing passion to carry them beyond the boundaries of propriety. But when they finally parted, breathless and flushed, the promise of more hung between them like a shared secret. "I should say good night," Zara murmured, though she made no move to leave his embrace. "You should," he agreed, equally reluctant to end their closeness. Eventually, responsibility prevailed. They separated, each retiring to their respective rooms with lingering glances and the certainty that something profound had shifted between them. The following day, the trails had cleared enough for safe travel. Gideon prepared to depart after breakfast, both of them aware that the interlude of enforced intimacy was ending, returning them to the reality of separate lives and ranches to maintain. "I'll come check on you in a few days," he promised as he mounted Thunder, the horse eager after his extended rest. "I'll hold you to that," Zara replied, her hand resting on his knee as she looked up at him. "Be safe, Gideon." The ride home was difficult but manageable, giving Gideon time to reflect on the seismic changes of the past days. By the time he reached his ranch, he had made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. January brought harsh weather and increasing isolation as blizzards swept through the valley, making travel between ranches dangerous and sometimes impossible. But whenever conditions allowed, Gideon made the journey to the Willows, or Zara to his ranch, their relationship deepening with each encounter. They spoke more openly of the future now, making tentative plans for combining their efforts come spring shared cattle drives, coordinated planting, improvements that would benefit both properties. Neither explicitly mentioned marriage, but the possibility hovered in their conversations, an unspoken destination toward which they were steadily moving. February arrived with a brief respite from the harsh conditions, a false spring that melted much of the snow before winter reasserted itself with renewed ferocity. During this temporary thaw, Gideon rode to Helena to conduct business and make a special purchase, a simple gold ring with a small pearl, elegant rather than ostentatious, that reminded him of Zara's quiet strength and natural beauty. He carried the ring in his pocket for weeks afterward, waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to ask the question that would change both their lives. But the severity of the weather conspired against him, keeping them apart for longer stretches than either preferred. It was mid-March before a true break in winter's grip allowed for easier travel. Gideon rode to the Willows immediately, the ring a comforting weight in his pocket, his heart alternating between certainty and nervousness. He found Zara in her garden, clearing away the last of the snow from the beds where she hoped to plant vegetables, once the ground thawed completely. She straightened at his approach, pushing a strand of hair from her face with a gloved hand, her smile warming him more effectively than the strengthening spring sun. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten the way," she teased, though the relief in her eyes at seeing him safe told a different story. "Never," he replied, dismounting to stand before her, "just waiting for a day when I wouldn't freeze solid halfway here." They embraced without hesitation now, the initial awkwardness of physical affection long since overcome. Gideon held her tightly, inhaling the scent of her hair, reacquainting himself with the feel of her in his arms after their forced separation. "I've missed you," she murmured against his chest. "And I you," he replied, reluctantly releasing her. "More than I can say." They spent the afternoon catching up, sharing news of their respective ranches and the challenges of the winter just passing. Zara had lost 2 sheep to wolves but had successfully delivered a difficult foaling. Gideon had repaired storm damage to his barn and begun planning for the spring cattle drive to the railhead in Helena. It wasn't until after dinner, as they sat before the fire with cups of coffee, that Gideon found the courage to broach the subject that had occupied his thoughts for weeks. "Zara," he began, setting his cup aside and turning to face her fully. "These past months have been, I never expected to find happiness again after Eleanor, never thought I deserved it, perhaps." She set her own cup down, sensing the importance of what he was trying to say. "Gideon, please," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish while I have the nerve." He took her hands in his, drawing strength from their warmth. "You came into my life when I was at my lowest point, standing alone at my wife's grave. You said I didn't have to be alone anymore, and you were right. Because of you, I'm not just existing but living again." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew the small velvet pouch containing the ring. "I love you, Zara Morgan, not in place of what I lost, but as something new and precious." He opened the pouch, revealing the simple gold band. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, joining our lives and our lands, facing whatever comes next together rather than apart." Zara's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she looked from the ring to his face. For a heart-stopping moment, Gideon feared he had misread her feelings, moved too quickly despite their careful pace. Then she smiled, a radiant expression that chased away all doubt. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Gideon Ryder." Relief and joy flooded through him as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it sat as if it had always belonged there. When he kissed her, it was with all the love and promise he could convey, a sealing of their commitment to build a future together from the broken pieces of their pasts. They agreed to marry in May, when the worst of spring's unpredictable weather would be past, and before the demands of summer ranch work became all-consuming. News of their engagement spread quickly through the scattered community, met with general approval and good wishes. Both had earned respect individually. Together, they represented the kind of resilience and mutual support that defined success in the challenging Montana territory. The weeks leading to their wedding were filled with preparation, practical arrangements for combining their households, decisions about which ranch would serve as their primary residence, discussions about hiring additional help to manage the expanded operation. They decided to make the Willows their home, its house being slightly larger and in better repair than Gideon's more Spartan dwelling. His ranch would continue operating with the help of a foreman and additional hands, the profits from both properties supporting their joint future. The wedding itself was simple but joyful, held in the Sweetwater Community Hall on a perfect May afternoon. Zara wore a new dress of ivory silk, ordered specially from Helena, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Gideon, uncomfortable in his rarely worn suit, forgot all discomfort the moment he saw her walking toward him down the makeshift aisle. The entire community turned out for the celebration that followed a potluck feast, music provided by local fiddlers, dancing that continued well into the evening. It was, everyone agreed, the most festive gathering the valley had seen in years. Later, when they were finally alone in the privacy of what was now their shared home, Gideon and Zara faced each other with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. For both, it had been years since physical intimacy had been part of their lives, and the transition from friendship to marriage brought with it new expectations and desires. "Are you certain?" Gideon asked softly, giving her one final opportunity to set her own pace. Zara's answer was to reach up and begin unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers steady despite the flush rising in her cheeks. "I have never been more certain of anything," she whispered. Their coming together was tender at first, tentative with rediscovery, then increasingly passionate as inhibitions fell away and mutual desire took precedence over hesitation. They learned each other's bodies with wonder and care, finding in their physical union the same harmony that had characterized their emotional connection. Afterward, lying together in the quiet darkness, Zara's head resting on his chest, Gideon felt a contentment so complete it bordered on disbelief. "Happy," she murmured, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. "Beyond words," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You, perfectly." She snuggled closer, her arm tightening across his waist. "I never thought I'd find this again." "Nor I." He traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, marveling at the softness of her skin. "Thank you for finding me that day at the cemetery." "Thank you for being brave enough to try again," she countered. "It takes courage to open your heart after loss." "Worth every moment of fear," he assured her, pulling her closer against the cooling night air. They fell asleep entwined, the first night of many they would spend together, the beginning of a shared life neither had dared to imagine possible just months before. Spring gave way to summer. and the newly married couple settled into a rhythm of work and companionship that suited them both perfectly. They rose early, worked side by side managing their expanded holdings, made decisions jointly, and fell into bed each night tired but deeply satisfied with the life they were building together. In late June, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zara turned to Gideon with an expression that immediately caught his attention. "I have news," she said, her voice carefully neutral though her eyes sparkled with suppressed emotion. "Good news, I hope," he replied, setting aside the leather bridle he'd been repairing. "I believe so." She took his hand, placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a child, Gideon, in January according to my calculations." For a moment, he could only stare at her in wonder, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of her announcement. Then joy surged through him, so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. "A child," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Our child." Zara nodded, her own eyes bright with happy tears. "Are you pleased?" In answer, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which to him she was. "More than I can possibly express," he whispered against her hair. "I love you, Zara Ryder, more every day, and I you, Gideon Ryder, always." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, his arm around her shoulders and her head nestled in the crook of his neck, Gideon reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief at Eleanor's grave to the promise of new life growing within his wife, it had been a path of healing and rediscovery he could never have imagined on that cold October day. Eleanor would always be part of him, a beloved memory he would cherish and honor. But life, with its infinite capacity for renewal, had given him a second chance at happiness, a chance he had been brave enough, finally, to grasp with both hands. As if reading his thoughts, Zara spoke softly into the comfortable silence between them. "I think Eleanor would be pleased, don't you?" "To know you found joy again." "I believe she would," he agreed, tightening his arm around her shoulders. "She always said life was for the living." They sat together until the stars emerged, brilliant against the darkening sky, each lost in private thoughts yet completely connected in the moment they shared. The future stretched before them, uncertain in its details as all futures must be, but rich with promise and possibility. In the years that followed, the Ryder Ranch prospered, expanding to become one of the most successful operations in the valley. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, was joined 2 years later by a son, Samuel. The family grew and thrived, weathering the inevitable challenges of life in the Montana Territory with the same resilience and mutual support that had characterized Gideon and Zara's relationship from the beginning. Sometimes, on the anniversary of Eleanor's death, Gideon would still visit her grave but no longer alone. Zara would accompany him, often with their children, to place wildflowers and spend a few moments in quiet remembrance. It was, they both believed, the proper way to honor the past while embracing the present and looking toward the future. And if, occasionally, visitors to the valley heard the story of how the taciturn rancher who once stood alone at his wife's grave found love again with the determined widow who told him he didn't have to be alone anymore, the tale was always recounted with a sense of life's remarkable capacity for second chances. For Gideon and Zara Ryder, what began in shared grief blossomed into a love story as vast and enduring as the Montana sky above them, proof that even in our darkest moments, the possibility of dawn remains, waiting only for us to be brave enough to lift our eyes and see it.